Guys, welcome back to the Unfiltered Political Lens. Today we're examining one of the most controversial questions in modern American history. Can a government go so far in the name of national security? And if so, how do citizens recognize the warning signs before it's too late? From the internment camps of World War II to the surveillance technologies of the digital age, this episode explores how extraordinary powers granted during these times of crises can reshape the relationships between the governments and the people they serve. Throughout history, governments have often expanded their authority during periods of war, instability, and public fear. Citizens frequently accepted restrictions on their liberty because they believed those sacrifices were necessary for their safety and national survival. Yet decades later, many of these same policies are re-examined and criticized as examples of government overreach, raising difficult questions about where the line between security and freedom should be drawn. The story begins after the Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. The fear spread rapidly across the United States, particularly along the West Coast, where military leadership and political officials warned that espionage and the sabotage might be imminent. Amid public anxiety, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed an Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942. Granting the military commanders the authority to designate an exclusion zone and remove the individuals from certain regions demanded strategically sensitive. Now, the result was one of the largest forced relocations in American history. More than 120,000 Japanese Americans were removed from their homes and sent to eminent camps scattered throughout remote areas of the country, as well as Germans and other Europeans as well. Approximately two-thirds of those interned were American citizens by birth, and many had never visited Japan. Families were given little notice to dispose of their property. Business, homes, farms, vehicles, and possessions all were before being relocated under the armed supervision. There were entire communities uprooted almost overnight. Businesses built over decades collapsed, and family farms were abandoned or sold at significant losses. Children were forced to leave schools, and families were often separated during the processing and relocation. There were many interns spent years behind barbed wire fences guarded by armed soldiers, despite never being formally charged with a crime. And one of the most significant aspects of this internment policy is that there was no evidence there was ever discovered showing widespread espionage or sabotage among the Japanese. The American population justified the mass relocation. The American people, they justified it anyhow without evidence. And later, the government investigations concluded that the military necessarily was not the primary driver behind the policy. In 1988, Congress had passed the Civil Liberties Act, formally apologizing for the internment and acknowledging that the racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and failures of the political leadership had played major roles in the government's decision. Although the Japanese American internment receives the most attention, it was not the only example of wartime restriction. Thousands of German nationals and German Americans were also detained or interned during World War II. Italian nationals living in the United States faced the travel restrictions, the curfews, and the monitoring. And in some cases, refugees who had fled Nazi Germany found themselves detained by the very government they believed that had represented freedom and democracy. And we went through this in my three-part series on the internment camp. The lessons many of the historians drew from these events is not simply that mistakes were made, but the governments operating under extraordinary circumstances often acquired powers they would never possess under normal conditions. History demonstrates that the fear can alter public's opinion or weaken the resistance to government expansion and create an environment where the constitutional protections are viewed as obstacles rather than safeguards for the people. Fast forward to the 21st century, and the nature of government and the power has changed dramatically. Instead of relying primarily on physical barriers, relocation centers, and detention facilities, governments now possess technologies capable of monitoring vast amounts of information in real time. The modern debate centers of digital surveillance, data collection, and predictive analytics, and the ability of the institutions to track the behavior through electronic systems. Following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, Congress passed the USA Patriot Act, significantly expanding the government's surveillance authorities. The supporters argued that the intelligence agencies needed additional tools to identify terrorist networks and to prevent future attacks. Critics warned that expanded surveillance powers could eventually be used in ways never intended by the lawmakers. One of those most significant surveillance authorities is Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. This program allows intelligence agencies to collect communications involving foreign individuals located outside of the United States. The officials argue that the program plays a critical role in identifying the terrorist threat, foreign espionage operations, and cyber attacks and transnational criminal organizations. However, privacy advocates point out that communications involving Americans can be identically collected when they interact with foreign individuals who are under surveillance. This has led to the intense debates regarding our constitutional protections, judicial oversight, transparency, and the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable search and seizures. The technology has transformed the surveillance capabilities beyond anything imaginable during the 1940s. The governments can now analyze enormous quantities of electronic communications, internet traffic, financial transactions, travel records, mobile device data, and social media activity. Artificial intelligence systems can identify patterns and predict behaviors and connect information across the databases at speeds impossible for humans or investigators, for that matter. The facial recognition technology has become another major point of controversy. These systems can compare the photographs against massive databases and identify the individuals within seconds. The supporters argue that facial recognition helps solve crimes and locate missing persons and improve the public safety. But the critics warn that the inaccurate identification and privacy concerns and the insufficient oversight could ultimately result in serious violations of people's civil liberties. Automated license plates as well for the automated plate readers, they have similarly expanded monitoring capabilities. They have systems that record the locations, dates, and times of vehicles traveling through the public spaces. And over time, the collected information can reveal the travel patterns, the personal habits, and associations. Privacy advocates argue that long-term storage of such data creates detailed records of citizen movements without requiring transitional warrants. And these data centers that Trump and them are wanting to build is also not going to help and our freedoms being taken from us. And then there's another area of concern which involves geolocation and tracking. Smartphones continuously generate location data that can reveal where people live, where they work and worship, shop, and socialize. Much of this information is collected by the private companies through apps and online services. The government agencies have, in some instances, purchased commercially available databases from data brokers to obtaining the information through direct court orders and raising the concerns about the potential constitutional loopholes. But the social media monitoring has also emerged as a powerful investigative tool. Public posts and comments, photographs, videos, and interactions can be analyzed to identify certain networks and trends and activities. While law enforcement agencies argue that such monitoring assists investigations, critics contend that the large-scale observation of lawful political speech could chill free expression and discourage civic participation. Artificial intelligence may represent the next frontier in this debate, but the advanced algorithms can analyze vast quantities of the information to identify suspicious behavior and predict future activities that it assesses potential threat. The supporters believe the system can increase not only efficiency, but it can improve public safety. They worry that opaque algorithms, biased databases or data sets, and automated decision making could also create new forms of discrimination and government overreach. The history suggests that every generation faces its own version of the same fundamental challenges. During World War II, the question centered on whether physical relocation and detention could be justified by national security concerns. Today, the question involves whether digital monitoring and surveillance databases and predictive technologies can be justified by similar arguments. Now, the comparison between the internment camps and the modern surveillance system is not exact. No credible historian suggests that contemporary surveillance programs are identical to the internment camps of the 40s. However, both situations, they do raise similar constitutional questions about executive authority civil liberties and due process, as well as accountability and the extent to which the fear can influence the public's policy. Perhaps the most important lesson from history is not the governments inevitably become oppressive, but that democratic societies require constant oversight, transparency, and public engagement. The constitutional protections exist precisely because the governments may be tempted to expand their authority during the emergency, and the challenges is ensuring that temporary powers do not become permanent features of the governance without the meaningful public debate. As technology continues advancing, the conversation surrounding the privacy, the security, and government authority is likely to become even more important. The artificial intelligence and the biometrics identification systems, the digital currencies and predictive analytics and interconnected databases may provide the governments with capabilities far beyond anything previously imagined. Whether those tools strengthen the liberty or weakens it, it may depend largely on the safeguards established today. The shadow of control is ultimately not about claiming the history is repeating itself. It is about recognizing the patterns and understanding the historical lessons and asking difficult questions before extraordinary powers become ordinary expectations. Every generation inherits the responsibility of protecting both security and freedom, and the balance between those two principles remains one of the defining challenges of the modern democracy. If you found this deep dive informative, make sure to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to the Unfiltered Political Lens. For more in-depth political analysis, historical investigations, and discussions that challenge conventional narratives, we appreciate every one of you for spending your time with us today and being part of the growing community. Thank you for tuning in to the Unfiltered Political Lens. We hope you enjoyed this episode, learned something new, and gained a deeper perspective on one of the most important debates of our time. We'll see you in the next episode. Until then, stay informed, stay curious, and as always, peace.